The village of Brimley had always prided itself on its tranquility, its cobbled streets lined with ivy-clad cottages, and its people who, though secretive at times, were mostly content in their ordinary lives. But on one fateful morning, that peace was shattered. Sarah Drummond, the ever-reliable postmistress, had vanished without a trace. Not a single sign of struggle, not even a goodbye. The only clue left behind was an odd letter, half burnt in the hearth. Its words faint but unmistakable. I know what you've done. Who had Sarah known too well, and what was she running from? In a village where everyone thought they knew everyone's business, Miss Marple knew better. Some secrets, after all, were too dark to remain hidden forever. Chapter 1. The Disappearance. The small village of Brimley was as picturesque as they come, nestled in the rolling hills of rural England. Its cobblestone streets, ivy-clad cottages, and friendly faces made it seem like the sort of place where nothing ever changed, and the clock ticked at a leisurely pace. But this ordinary day would soon become anything but ordinary. The morning began with a sudden and unsettling change. Sarah Drummond, the postmistress of Brimley, had vanished. No one knew where she had gone, and no one could explain why. It wasn't like Sarah to simply disappear. She was the heart of the village, the steady presence who ran the post office with an unshakable sense of order. Everyone knew her, and she knew everyone. Her disappearance would be felt by every resident, though none more so than Miss Marple, who had known Sarah since she was a child. Miss Marple sat by the window of her cozy home, watching the village square, where the church bell rang in the distance. She had heard the news of Sarah's disappearance early that morning, and while the rest of the town buzzed with speculation, Miss Marple remained calm. There was something in the air, something that didn't sit right with her. It wasn't just the disappearance itself. It was the way Sarah had been acting in the days before. Why, I do believe I saw her walking towards the woods last Tuesday. Miss Marple mused to herself, her sharp eyes narrowing behind her glasses. And that look on her face, it was one I've seen before. A look of someone trying to escape, but from what? The local constable, Inspector Smith, was a man in his 30s, eager but green around the edges. His uniform, though crisply pressed, couldn't mask the furrow of worry etched across his forehead. He had arrived at Sarah's house just before Miss Marple did, and the two exchanged nods as she approached. Well, Miss Marple, Inspector Smith said, with a forced smile, I suppose you've heard the news? I have indeed, she replied. But I'm afraid I don't quite believe she's simply run off. I've known Sarah for a long time, and she's not the type to leave without a word, not to mention the fact that she hasn't taken a single personal belonging. He scratched his chin, clearly uncertain. But we can't rule out the possibility. People do strange things sometimes, Miss Marple. No, Inspector, Miss Marple said softly, her voice firm yet calm. Not her. There's something more to this. They stood outside Sarah's cottage, a quaint, ivy-covered building on the edge of the village. As villagers passed by, their faces full of questions and curiosity. Inside the cottage, it was eerily still. No sign of struggle, no items missing, and no indication that anyone had forced entry. It was as though Sarah had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Yet Miss Marple noticed the smallest detail, the faintest of footprints, in the flower bed near the back door, as though someone had been standing there just the night before. Take a look at this, Miss Marple said, crouching down to inspect the print. She was standing here, or someone was. Inspector Smith bent down, his eyes following her line of sight. A footprint looks like a small one. Could have been Sarah's. Miss Marple shook her head. No, this is too faint. It's someone else's. Someone who didn't want to be seen. They entered Sarah's home, and Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. On the fireplace mantel, Sarah's half-finished knitting project sat abandoned, the needles poised mid-stitch. It was unlike Sarah to leave her work in such disarray. But what really caught Miss Marple's attention was the small burned scrap of paper that had been left in the fire. The edges were singed and the ink had smudged, but Miss Marple could make out a few legible words, "Meet me," and something that looked like an address. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, picking it up carefully. "This is interesting, isn't it?" Someone was expecting a meeting. Inspector Smith raised an eyebrow. Could it be a lover's quarrel? Miss Marple gave him a wry smile. Perhaps. But I think the answer lies in this scrap of paper, and I don't think we're dealing with something as simple as that. She stood, adjusting her glasses, her eyes darting around the room. She didn't need to say it aloud. She knew the truth. Sarah's disappearance was no accident. There was a secret, something she'd been hiding, and it was only a matter of time before the village would find out. Before Miss Marple could speak again, a voice interrupted their thoughts. It was Margaret Wood, Sarah's longtime friend, who had just arrived at the cottage, looking flustered. She had been out walking when she heard the news and had rushed over. "Oh, Miss Marple," Margaret exclaimed, wringing her hands. "I can't believe it." "Sarah? She's always been so reliable. She wouldn't just disappear." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, giving her a knowing glance. "Tell me, Margaret, have you noticed anything unusual in the past few days? Anything that might explain why Sarah isn't here?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "Well, now that you mention it, I did notice she seemed a bit off. More distant, perhaps." She wasn't quite herself. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the doorway. "You don't suppose she was hiding something, do you?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "Hiding something? What do you mean?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was thinking. Could Margaret be hiding something herself? As Margaret's footsteps faded down the road, Miss Marple turned to Inspector Smith. "I think we've just begun to scratch the surface, Inspector. This isn't just a simple case of a woman leaving her life behind. There's something much more sinister at work here." The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the village. The quiet was still there, but something had changed. The mystery of Sarah Drummond's disappearance had only just begun. And Miss Marple knew, with a certainty she didn't care to explain, that it was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. The village of Brimley, though small and often overlooked, had a curious way of swallowing up its secrets. News of Sarah Drummond's sudden disappearance had spread like wildfire, with each whisper more frantic than the last. By the time the evening bell rang, the village square was alive with murmurs and speculation. Despite the growing frenzy, Inspector Smith remained focused. A few hours had passed since his arrival at Sarah's cottage, and while nothing overtly suspicious had been found, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. And then there was Miss Marple, whose calm demeanor both intrigued and unsettled him. She seemed to know more than she let on, but her cryptic remarks only raised more questions. Miss Marple, though, had no intention of making things clear just yet. As she sat in her favorite armchair by the window, sipping a cup of tea, she reflected on the little details she'd gathered that day. Something about Sarah's disappearance didn't sit right with her. The scrap of burned paper, the odd mark near the back door. It all pointed to something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple made a decision. She would visit Margaret Wood, Sarah's closest friend. Margaret, in Miss Marple's estimation, knew more than she was letting on. Margaret's cottage was located just outside the village, nestled along a narrow, winding path. Miss Marple made her way there after dinner, the cool evening air rustling the leaves in the trees. Margaret, she suspected, was the key to unlocking Sarah's mystery. When Miss Marple arrived, Margaret greeted her at the door with a strained smile, her face pale, eyes tired. She had clearly been up all day, but Miss Marple didn't think it was exhaustion that made Margaret look so drawn. "Good evening, Margaret," Miss Marple said pleasantly, stepping into the modest home. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Oh, not at all, Miss Marple." "I'm glad you came," Margaret replied quickly, leading her into the sitting room. She offered a seat by the fire, and Miss Marple accepted, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Everything looked as it should. The tidy furniture, the neat shelves of books, the quiet warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. But something felt off, an unsettled tension in the air. "I've been thinking a great deal about Sarah," Miss Marple said softly, settling into her chair. "You were very close, weren't you?" Margaret nodded, her hands wringing the tea towel in her lap. "Yes, Sarah was like a sister to me. We spent so much time together, you know. I can't understand what's happened to her. She would never just leave." Miss Marple watched her closely. "But did she seem different to you in the last few days? You said she'd been acting strangely, didn't you?" Margaret stiffened slightly. "Well, yes. Now that you mention it, she was distant, more anxious. I thought it was just stress, maybe. You know how it is, Miss Marple, with all the work she has at the post office. But now..." Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding, though she did not say anything right away. She gave Margaret time to gather her thoughts. "Was she seeing anyone, perhaps?" Miss Marple asked, her voice casual but pointed. Margaret froze, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "What do you mean?" "Well," Miss Marple said, leaning forward slightly. "Sarah was a young woman after all. Perhaps someone had caught her eye, a new love interest maybe." That could explain her sudden disappearance. Margaret's eyes darted to the fire, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she murmured after a pause. "She did talk about someone once, just once, but I thought it was nothing serious. I thought she was just being silly." Miss Marple waited. "Who was he?" Margaret hesitated, glancing nervously at the door as if to make sure no one was listening. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "David Bennett," she said, almost in a whisper. "The shopkeeper." Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the dots. David Bennett had been a fixture in Brimley for years, running the small village shop, always smiling, always friendly. But that didn't necessarily mean he was the harmless figure he appeared to be. "You said she mentioned him once?" Miss Marple asked, trying to sound casual. "What did she say about him?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Not much. Just that he was kind to her, always checking in on her. She said he was dependable, that's all. But I don't know. It was just a feeling, I suppose. I've always felt something wasn't quite right about him." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind churning. "What do you mean by not quite right?" Margaret's voice dropped to a near whisper. "He's always around, always watching her." I don't trust him. But Sarah never seemed to notice. The conversation hung in the air, thick with the unspoken. Miss Marple studied Margaret's face carefully. The woman was clearly nervous, anxious about something, perhaps her own involvement in Sarah's disappearance. But she wasn't lying. There was genuine concern in her eyes. I see, Miss Marple said, slowly. And what about Sarah's personal life, Margaret? Was there anything else strange in the days leading up to her disappearance? Margaret looked down at her hands again, her fingers trembling slightly. She received a letter just before she disappeared. She didn't show it to me, but I saw the envelope. It was addressed to her in a very unusual handwriting, and when I asked her about it, she said it was nothing but nothing, Miss Marple prompted. Margaret shook her head. No, she was upset. She wouldn't talk about it. She just put it away, locked it in the drawer, and the next morning, she was gone. Miss Marple stood, her eyes never leaving Margaret. Thank you, Margaret. You've been very helpful, but I believe the answers to Sarah's disappearance lie in those letters, both the one she burned and the one she received. I must find out who sent them and why Margaret's face grew pale. You think it's him, don't you? David Bennett? Miss Marple smiled softly. I think we should keep an open mind. But yes, I do believe David Bennett holds some answers. With that, Miss Marple bid Margaret good night and left the cottage, her mind more focused than ever. The mystery had deepened, but one thing was clear. Sarah had been hiding something, and the key to her disappearance might just lie in the hands of someone she trusted. As Miss Marple walked back through the village, the streets now quiet under the heavy cloak of night, she thought of the odd details of the strange envelope, the burned letter, and David Bennett's peculiar proximity to Sarah. The puzzle pieces are starting to fall into place, she thought to herself. But what I need is a confession. The investigation was only just beginning, and Miss Marple knew it wouldn't be long before the secrets of Brimley began to surface. Whether its residents liked it or not, Chapter 3. The secrets start to unfold. The morning after her conversation with Margaret, Miss Marple rose early, the pale light of dawn streaming through the curtains of her small cottage. As she sipped her tea, her mind was already turning over the information she had gathered. The mention of David Bennett's name, the strange letter, Margaret's unease. There was something significant hiding in all of this. Something far more complicated than a simple disappearance. Miss Marple knew, of course, that appearances could be deceiving, especially in a village like Brimley. There was a tendency for people to know just enough to be dangerous and not enough to be of real help. The most telling secrets she knew were often hidden in the details, and it was those very details that would lead her to the truth. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had decided to pay a visit to David Bennett's shop. As she walked down the village lane, she couldn't help but notice the way the villagers stared at her, their eyes full of curiosity and suspicion. It was clear that they were all trying to make sense of Sarah's disappearance, and in doing so, were eager to share their own theories. Some whispered of a secret love affair, others of a possible argument gone wrong. But Miss Marple had no time for idle gossip. She had a mind to find the facts. David Bennett's shop was a quaint establishment, tucked between the local bakery and a row of whitewashed cottages. The smell of fresh bread wafted through the air, mingling with the earthy scent of old wood and leather. Inside, the shop was meticulously organized, shelves lined with jars of preserves, tins of tea, and neatly arranged produce. It was a typical village shop, unassuming but comforting. David Bennett was behind the counter, humming a tune as he arranged cans of soup. When Miss Marple entered, he looked up with a warm smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. What can I do for you today?" he asked, his voice friendly, but a little too polished. There was a slight nervousness in his eyes that Miss Marple didn't miss. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she replied, her tone light but purposeful. "I was hoping to have a word with you about Sarah Drummond. I'm sure you've heard that she's gone missing." David's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps? "Yes, I've heard," he said, his voice growing quieter. "Terrible business. She was such a fine woman, always so dependable." "Dependable indeed," Miss Marple replied, her eyes never leaving his face. "I was wondering if you'd seen her recently. Before she vanished, I mean. Margaret tells me you two were quite close." David's face tightened at the mention of Margaret, and Miss Marple couldn't help but note how his eyes darted to the back of the shop. "We were friends, yes," he said, his voice steady, but tinged with something that Miss Marple couldn't place. "Nothing more than that, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple said, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "But I understand you were one of the last to see her, perhaps?" David's jaw tightened imperceptibly. I saw her on the morning she disappeared. She came by for some stamps, as usual. She seemed in a bit of a hurry, but she was fine. Nothing unusual." "Really?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, a thread of doubt weaving into her words. "Margaret mentioned that Sarah had been acting strangely in the days before she vanished. Is that true? Was there anything that struck you as odd?" David shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said quickly. "She was just stressed, I suppose. A lot of work at the post office, you know?" But Sarah was always a hard worker. Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice dropping to a softer, more measured tone. "And what about the letter she received?" Margaret mentioned that Sarah had been upset after getting a letter just before she disappeared. "Do you know anything about that?" At the mention of the letter, David's face turned pale, his eyes flicking toward the door. I don't know anything about that," he said quickly, but Miss Marple could see the subtle nervousness in his hands, which were now trembling slightly as he adjusted the cans on the counter. "I see," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but with an edge. "Well, I do appreciate your time, Mr. Bennett. I'm sure you've been as concerned about Sarah's disappearance as anyone. If you happen to remember anything at all, I would be most grateful for your cooperation." David nodded quickly, but his eyes never quite met hers. "Of course, Miss Marple. I'll let you know if I think of anything." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she caught one last glimpse of David's face. There was something there, something in his expression that told her he was hiding something. She didn't know what it was yet, but she could feel it. David Bennett was more involved in Sarah's disappearance than he let on. Outside the shop, Miss Marple stood for a moment, her mind whirring with new possibilities. David's nervousness wasn't the only thing that bothered her. The way he had reacted to the mention of the letter was telling. Why had he been so quick to deny any knowledge of it? And why had he seemed so uncomfortable when she asked about Sarah's mood before her disappearance? It didn't take a detective to see that he was hiding something, and Miss Marple was determined to find out what. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the post office. She spoke briefly with the assistant, a young woman named Jane, who hadn't seen Sarah since the morning of her disappearance. According to Jane, Sarah had seemed normal. perhaps a little distracted, but nothing unusual. Jane mentioned that Sarah had been under a great deal of pressure lately, trying to sort through an overwhelming amount of paperwork, but again, nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't much to go on, but Miss Marple was beginning to see a pattern. Sarah's disappearance seemed to be linked to more than just her work at the post office. There were other factors, hidden things Sarah had tried to protect. Miss Marple knew she needed to dig deeper, but for now, the only thing that stood out was that the people closest to Sarah, Margaret, David, and even the post office assistant, were all hiding something. And Sarah herself had left behind a trail of mysteries, from the letter she received to the strange behavior in her final days. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but Miss Marple was careful not to jump to conclusions. One thing was certain, however: Sarah's disappearance was no accident, and it was only a matter of time before Miss Marple unraveled the secrets that had been buried beneath the surface of Brimley for far too long. Chapter 4. The Mayor's Role. Miss Marple had spent the following days piecing together what she could from the scattered threads of Sarah's life. There was something deeper than a simple disappearance at work here, and the more she investigated, the more she realized the web of connections surrounding Sarah Drummond was not as innocent as it appeared. After her visit to David Bennett's shop, she found herself growing more certain that he was hiding something significant. But as she walked through the village, her thoughts kept returning to another name Margaret had whispered with unease: the mayor of Brimley, Charles Woodford. Charles Woodford was a man who, on the surface, seemed as harmless as any local official could be. A tall, distinguished man with a taste for fine tailoring and the air of someone who had lived comfortably all his life. His family had held a long-standing position in the village, and his reputation was spotless. At least, that's what the villagers believed. But Miss Marple's sharp intuition told her that Charles Woodford might be more involved in Sarah's disappearance than anyone realized. The mayor's office was located in the center of the village, an imposing stone building surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and old oak trees. It was a place where only the most important matters of the village were discussed. As Miss Marple approached, she felt a strange weight in the air, as though the building itself were hiding something. Perhaps it was the quiet stillness of the day, or perhaps it was the way the villagers avoided speaking about Woodford in casual conversation. As she stepped inside, the cool air of the building hit her. The mayor's office was large and austere, filled with dark wood paneling, heavy curtains, and portraits of past mayors. Woodford himself was standing behind his desk, his back straight as he read over a stack of papers. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression briefly flitting from surprise to a polite smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, what brings you here today?" His voice was smooth, confident. But Miss Marple noticed a slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers paused on the edge of the papers as if he were reluctant to let them go. "I was hoping to have a word with you, Mr. Woodford," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear. "About Sarah Drummond. I understand she worked closely with the post office, but I've been wondering if you might know anything more about her recent activities. She seemed to have been quite upset in the days leading up to her disappearance." Woodford's smile didn't falter, but his eyes tightened. "Sarah? Yes, I knew her well enough. She was a very dedicated woman, always professional, always on top of her work." He paused, his gaze flicking briefly to the window. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about her being upset. Perhaps it was the pressure of her job. As you said, these small towns can become quite suffocating for some people." Miss Marple studied him carefully. He was good, Too good, in fact. The smoothness of his response, the way he avoided answering her direct question, it all spoke to something Miss Marple was beginning to recognize. "I see," she said, her voice unchanged. "But you did know her, did you not? I'm sure you've had many interactions with her over the years." "Yes, of course," Woodford replied quickly. "But nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would suggest she might suddenly disappear, if that's what you mean." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "No, of course not. But I understand that sometimes people have other reasons for acting out a character. For example, I've heard rumors that Sarah was involved in something more than just her work at the post office." The mayor's hand faltered, his eyes flicking down to the papers on his desk. Miss Marple knew she had hit a nerve. "Perhaps you might know what I'm referring to," she added, her tone light but piercing. Woodford's smile wavered. "I can't say that I do," he said, his voice growing a touch cold. "And frankly, I don't see how my involvement in this is any more than what I've already told you. I'm just the mayor of Brimley. I don't concern myself with the private lives of the townsfolk. Miss Marple wasn't fooled. She had seen enough in her time to know when someone was hiding the truth, and Woodford's evasions were too deliberate to be coincidental." "I understand, Mr. Woodford," she said, her voice calm. "But I do wonder if there's more to Sarah's disappearance than anyone realizes. You see, I've been hearing rumors of a relationship between Sarah and a certain person, someone who might have had influence over her." The mayor stiffened, his face turning pale for a moment. He cleared his throat, his voice a little hoarser. "What exactly are you implying, Miss Marple?" he asked, his eyes narrowing now. "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Woodford," Miss Marple said softly. "I'm simply asking the right questions." "It's what I do." You see, Woodford's face was now as cold as ice, but Miss Marple could sense the cracks forming. He wasn't used to being cornered, and he didn't like it. "I think you know more about this than you're letting on," Miss Marple continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You've had dealings with Sarah, haven't you? There's more to her life than just the post office, and I'm sure you'd be willing to tell me what that more is." For a long moment there was silence. The ticking of a clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, echoing in the stillness of the room. Finally, Woodford broke the silence with a harsh laugh, one that was filled with frustration. "I've told you everything I know," he snapped, rising from his chair and moving towards the window. He didn't look at Miss Marple as he spoke. Sarah was a good woman, but she didn't know when to stop meddling in things that didn't concern her. Miss Marple watched him closely, her sharp eyes taking in every movement. "What sort of things?" she asked, her voice low. Woodford turned sharply, his eyes now dark with something more than just irritation. "Things that could ruin lives," he said quietly. "Things that people like you and Sarah have no business knowing." Miss Marple stood up, her face serene. "I see. Well, Mr. Woodford, I don't believe you're being entirely forthcoming with me, but I won't press any further, at least not today." Woodford's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak as she turned to leave. Miss Marple knew she had gotten under his skin, and that was enough for now. The mayor had something to hide, and Miss Marple was more certain than ever that his involvement in Sarah's disappearance was far from over. As Miss Marple left the mayor's office, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the village's secrets closing in. There was something about Sarah's disappearance that tied into a much larger story, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it piece by piece. She had no doubt that the mayor would soon find himself in the middle of this puzzle, whether he wanted to be or not. And as the door to the mayor's office closed behind her, Miss Marple smiled to herself. The next step was clear. She would need to find out exactly what Sarah had uncovered before her disappearance, and why the mayor had been so eager to keep it hidden. Diary Chapter 5. Uncovering the affair. The morning after her visit to the mayor, Miss Marple couldn't shake the growing sense that the case was beginning to take a more sinister turn. Charles Woodford had made it clear that he was not an easy man to unravel, but Miss Marple was accustomed to patience. It wasn't the first time a smooth exterior had hidden a world of secrets. As Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, sipping her tea, her thoughts returned to Sarah Drummond and the rumors swirling around her sudden disappearance. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that there was one thread that had to be pulled: an affair. Sarah had been involved in something secret, and it was no coincidence that the village had been filled with whispers of her closeness to both David Bennett and Charles Woodford. But it was more than that. Sarah had kept her distance from the rest of the village, growing more distant in the last few weeks, hiding something she could no longer bear. Miss Marple needed to understand what, and she knew where to look for the answer. The first stop that morning was Margaret Wood's house. The mention of the mayor's name had unsettled Miss Marple, but she knew that Margaret, who had been Sarah's closest confidant, could hold the key to understanding the true nature of the postmistress's life. The connection between Margaret and Charles Woodford had always been close, but it was starting to feel like that connection might hold more significance than anyone had suspected. As Miss Marple arrived at the door, Margaret greeted her with a forced smile. The usual warmth in her eyes was replaced by a dull, almost anxious look. Margaret had clearly been expecting this visit. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, ushering her into the sitting room. "I didn't expect you to come back so soon." "Good morning, Margaret," Miss Marple replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, of course not," Margaret said, wringing her hands in her lap. "I've just been thinking a lot about Sarah lately." "I still can't believe she's gone." Miss Marple studied Margaret carefully. There was a nervousness about her that hadn't been there before. Something was different. "I've been thinking about Sarah as well," Miss Marple said, choosing her words carefully. "There's something I wanted to ask you. Something I need to understand." Margaret's eyes flickered with hesitation, but she nodded, bracing herself. "What is it, Miss Marple?" "You mentioned before that Sarah had been acting strangely in the days leading up to her disappearance. You also mentioned an affair, something to do with David Bennett." Margaret's face paled, and her hands twisted tightly in her lap. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Yeah, I didn't think you knew about that." Miss Marple's voice was soft but persistent. "I know a great deal more than I let on, Margaret. And I'm afraid I need to know everything. This affair, was it more than just a passing thing?" Margaret shifted again, clearly struggling to find the words. "It wasn't just David Bennett," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah was involved with someone else. Someone much more influential. Someone I never expected. She was involved with Charles Woodford." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "The mayor. The same man who had been so evasive just days ago." It all made sense now. The secrecy, the tension in the air whenever his name was mentioned. Sarah had known something dangerous enough to make her a target. "Are you certain?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward. "Charles Woodford?" Margaret nodded, her face pale. "Yes, they'd been seeing each other for months. It started with a few meetings about village matters, but then it became more than that. I didn't know what to do. I never imagined that Sarah, she was always so proper, so dependable, would get involved with someone like him. Miss Marple's mind raced. It made sense. Sarah's sudden withdrawal, her secretive behavior, and now this revelation. She had been hiding an affair with the mayor, a man who held immense power in the village. And if anyone found out, the consequences could be disastrous. Did Sarah tell you why she got involved with him? Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Margaret bit her lip, her eyes welling with tears. She didn't say much, but she mentioned once that she thought he might have been using her. She said he had something on her, something that could ruin her life. I didn't know what she meant, but she seemed afraid. Afraid of him. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Something on her, something that could ruin her life. She had seen enough to know that people were capable of hiding their deepest secrets, especially when their reputation and livelihood were at stake. I see, Miss Marple said, her tone firm. And did she say anything else? About the letter she received? About what happened the night before she disappeared? Margaret hesitated as if debating whether or not to reveal more. Finally she spoke, her voice shaky. She said she was going to confront him. She didn't tell me much, but I overheard her talking on the phone the night before she left. She said she was going to meet him to finally put an end to everything. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. Sarah had planned to confront Charles Woodford. The mayor's involvement in this affair went deeper than just a simple romance. There were secrets. Secrets that had to be hidden at any cost. Miss Marple stood up, her expression resolute. Thank you, Margaret. You've been very helpful. I believe I now understand more than I did before. Margaret stood, as well, wiping her eyes. I just want to find Sarah. I just want to know where she is. Miss Marple gave her a sympathetic smile. We all do, Margaret, and I'm certain we'll get to the bottom of this. But I need you to be strong. You may not like what we find, but it's the truth that matters now. As Miss Marple left Margaret's cottage, her thoughts were clearer than ever. The affair with the mayor wasn't just about passion or desire, it was about power. Charles Woodford had used his influence to manipulate Sarah, perhaps even threatening her with something she couldn't afford to have exposed. And Sarah, in turn, had planned to end it all before it was too late. But what had she uncovered? And what had happened in that final confrontation? The sun was setting as Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, her mind spinning with the new revelations. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there was still much to uncover. She had to confront Charles Woodford, and soon. The mayor had been involved in more than just an affair. He had something to hide, and Miss Marple was determined to find out exactly what it was. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Miss Marple knew that the time for questions was nearly over. Soon, the answers would be clear, and the truth would come to light. Chapter 6. The Hidden Safe. The morning air in Brimley was crisp, the kind of cool breeze that seemed to sharpen one's thoughts. Miss Marple stood at her cottage window, staring out at the village that had become the epicenter of a mystery that had gripped its quiet life. Sarah Drummond's disappearance, though a shock, was now part of a much larger puzzle. The affair with the mayor, the hidden threats, and the strange behavior. There was something about it all that Miss Marple couldn't yet put her finger on, but she had a lead now. Margaret's revelation about Sarah's plan to confront Charles Woodford had sparked something. It wasn't just the affair or the blackmail that had driven Sarah into hiding. There was more, something Sarah had uncovered that was dangerous enough to make her disappear. That morning, after a restful night, Miss Marple decided to visit Sarah's house once more. This time, she would search with more purpose. Something told her that Sarah had hidden away the answers in the place she knew best, her home. When Miss Marple arrived at Sarah's cottage, the sun had risen high enough to cast long shadows across the small, neat garden. The house was quiet, just as it had been the first time she'd arrived, and the door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. She stepped inside, her shoes making little sound on the wooden floorboards. As she entered the sitting room, she immediately noted the same calm atmosphere as before, the tidy shelves, the faint smell of lavender that always lingered in Sarah's home. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes picked out the subtle differences. The abandoned knitting project, the untidy desk, the half-burnt letter in the fireplace. All these small things told a story that Miss Marple was determined to read. She moved toward the desk, which was still cluttered with unopened letters, bills, and the remnants of Sarah's work at the post office. But it was the bottom drawer that caught her attention. Miss Marple knew that people often hid things in the most obvious of places. She crouched down and opened the drawer, sifting through papers until her fingers brushed against something hard, something out of place. A small key was wedged beneath a pile of old envelopes. It was a simple brass key, small enough to be overlooked, yet unmistakably important. She held the key in her hand, feeling the weight of it. There was something about it that felt heavy. Heavy with meaning. She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on Sarah's modest furniture, her meticulous belongings. Then, without a second thought, Miss Marple stood up and made her way toward the back of the cottage, the attic. It had been locked on her last visit, but now the key was in her hand. She approached the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking underfoot as she ascended to the attic. The door at the top was a simple one, but the key slid in smoothly, and she turned it, hearing the satisfying click as the lock disengaged. The attic was dim, filled with dust and the scent of old paper. Boxes of forgotten belongings were stacked along the walls, but Miss Marple wasn't interested in any of them. She moved to the far corner, where an old trunk sat hidden beneath a dusty blanket. Her heart skipped a beat as she approached it, her fingers trembling slightly with anticipation. Miss Marple knelt down, unlocking the trunk. The lid creaked as it opened, revealing a jumble of items. Old clothes, photographs, and various knickknacks. But there at the bottom was a small locked safe, its metal surface glinting faintly in the low light. Her heart raced. This was it. The thing Sarah had hidden. The thing that could explain everything. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her fingers brushing over the small safe. She felt along the edge, looking for a keyhole. After a moment, her fingers found it, a small round lock tucked beneath the lip of the safe. It was familiar to her, the same key from the drawer. It would fit. She inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, and Miss Marple opened the safe. Inside, the safe was packed with neatly stacked documents and letters. Miss Marple sifted through them quickly, her eyes scanning the words for anything that would explain Sarah's disappearance. There were letters from the mayor, from David Bennett, and even from someone named R. Taylor, an unknown name that sent a shiver down her spine. The last letter she pulled out was a thick envelope, sealed tightly with red wax. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter from Charles Woodford, written in neat, formal handwriting. It read, "Sarah, I have kept my word. Your silence will be rewarded. But remember, your secret is mine as much as it is yours. The post office will continue to be yours to run, but you must never tell anyone about our arrangement." If you do, everything will be exposed. Your family, your life, everything you've worked for. I will destroy it all. There is still time to reconsider. C. Miss Marple's fingers trembled as she read the letter, her mind racing. This was what Sarah had feared. Woodford wasn't just using her for an affair, he was blackmailing her. The mayor had something on Sarah, something so terrible, so damning, that she had no choice but to comply. The power that he held over her was immense, and it had driven Sarah to this point. She put the letter down gently, her mind whirling. Charles Woodford had threatened to ruin Sarah's life, and it seemed that Sarah had been preparing to reveal everything. But something had gone wrong. The letter was written just days before her disappearance, and it was clear from the mayor's words that Sarah had planned to confront him. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The affair, the blackmail, the letter, and the mayor's involvement. It was all connected. Sarah had been trying to free herself from Woodford's grip, and she had gone missing just before she could make that final confrontation. But Miss Marple knew this was only one part of the puzzle. What had happened after Sarah went to meet the mayor? Had she been silenced before she could expose him? Miss Marple stood up slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of the discovery. She knew what she had to do next. The mayor would have to be confronted, and the truth would have to come out. She had the evidence now. There was no turning back. As Miss Marple left Sarah's house, the safe locked once more. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the brink of something far darker than she had imagined. The answers were in front of her, but the hardest part was still to come. Charles Woodford had hidden his secrets for far too long, and Miss Marple would be the one to expose them. The village of Brimley would never be the same again. Chapter 7. Uncovering the Web of Lies. The events of the past few days had weighed heavily on Miss Marple's mind. The truth was clearer now. Sarah Drummond had been involved in something much darker than anyone had imagined. The letter from the mayor, the affair, the blackmail, and the hidden documents in the safe. It was all tied together in a way that spoke of desperation, manipulation, and power. But there was still one piece left to uncover. What had happened in the hours leading up to Sarah's disappearance? Miss Marple knew that the time had come to confront Charles Woodford directly. The mayor was the key, and he was growing more dangerous by the minute. She had gathered enough evidence to expose him. But there was still much to understand about the depths of his manipulation. As Miss Marple prepared for her meeting with Woodford, she couldn't help but think of the people around her. Margaret Wood, who had been caught in the web of secrets and lies, and David Bennett, whose involvement was still unclear but whose nervousness had made Miss Marple wary. Everyone had their own part to play in the story, but the mayor was the linchpin. If she could make him talk, everything would fall into place. The mayor's office was as imposing as ever. Tall stone walls, thick curtains, and the faint scent of cigars in the air. Woodford was seated behind his desk, his hands steepled in front of him, as if he had been expecting this conversation for some time. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm. Miss Marple entered without hesitation, her eyes sharp and calculating. She knew this would be the moment that either cracked the case wide open or sent her spiraling deeper into the mystery. "Miss Marple?" Woodford greeted her, his voice smooth but edged with a hint of tension. "What brings you to my office today?" "I believe we have some unfinished business, Mr. Woodford," Miss Marple replied, her voice firm and unyielding. "Sarah Drummond. Her disappearance, the affair you had with her, and the blackmail you orchestrated. It's time to stop pretending." Charles Woodford's face remained impassive, though his eyes flickered for the briefest of moments. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice colder now. Sarah was a grown woman and she made her choices. I have nothing to do with her disappearance. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. I beg to differ. You see, I have a letter. A letter you wrote to Sarah just days before she vanished. You threatened her, didn't you? You held something over her head, something that could ruin her life. And when she tried to end it, to confront you, you couldn't let that happen, could you? Woodford's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Miss Marple saw something flicker behind the facade of power he had built around himself. But it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. I don't know what you think you found, Miss Marple, but you're mistaken. Sarah was just another woman who couldn't handle the pressure. She chose to run away, and now she's gone. That's the end of it. Miss Marple didn't flinch. She had expected this denial, this attempt to deflect, but she wasn't about to let him off the hook. No, Mr. Woodford, that's not the end of it. You see, Sarah was going to expose you. She had uncovered something about your dealings, something you didn't want anyone to know. And that's why she's gone. Woodford's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple could see that the cracks in his armor were beginning to show. Do you know what I think, Mr. Woodford? Miss Marple continued. I think Sarah went to confront you, to demand that you end your hold over her. But something went wrong. You didn't want her to tell anyone, did you? So you silenced her. You couldn't afford for her to ruin everything you had worked so hard to build. There was a long silence in the room, and for a moment Miss Marple wondered if she had pushed him too far. But then Woodford's expression changed, and he looked at her, his eyes cold and calculating. You're right about one thing, Miss Marple, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah did know too much. But it wasn't just about me. It was about everything. About all the people who've benefited from my arrangements. I didn't want her to destroy that, to ruin the things I've built. She thought she could threaten me, but she was wrong. Miss Marple could feel the tension in the room building, but she didn't back down. So, you did it, she said quietly. You made her disappear. Woodford's lips twisted into a bitter smile. I didn't make her disappear. She made that choice. She wanted to take control of her life, but she didn't know what she was up against. I simply made sure she didn't have the chance to ruin everything I've worked for. Miss Marple's heart raced. The mayor wasn't just a man trying to cover up an affair. He had been orchestrating something far larger, using his power to manipulate the village and keep his secrets hidden. But Sarah had gotten too close, and in her attempt to expose him, she had paid the price. As Miss Marple absorbed the gravity of Woodford's words, she realized something crucial. There was still a chance Sarah had left a trail, a final message, something that could expose Woodford once and for all. But she had to act fast. Before Miss Marple could say another word, the door to the office opened abruptly. It was David Bennett, his face pale and drawn. He looked at Miss Marple, then at Woodford, and his eyes widened, with a mixture of fear and guilt. David? Miss Marple asked, her voice laced with curiosity. What are you doing here? David didn't answer immediately. He stepped into the room, his eyes darting between Miss Marple and Woodford. I need to talk, he said, his voice trembling. I can't keep this to myself anymore. Woodford stood up quickly, his face contorting with anger. What are you talking about, Bennett? He snapped. David hesitated, then turned to Miss Marple. I know about the blackmail, about what happened to Sarah. I wasn't involved, but I knew enough. I just couldn't stand it anymore. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the breakthrough she needed? David, she said gently, tell me everything. It's the only way to stop this. David took a deep breath, and for the first time, he seemed to gather some courage. Sarah had found something that could expose Woodford's dealings. I don't know what it was exactly, but I know she was planning to reveal it, and I think she had a copy of it. Miss Marple's mind raced. Sarah had left behind a copy of the evidence. Where was it? Had Woodford found it? And would David be able to help her uncover it before it was too late? The pieces were finally coming together, but Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous part of the mystery was still ahead. Woodford had no intention of letting anyone uncover the truth, and now, with David's confession, the stakes had never been higher. The web of lies was unraveling, and soon everything will be exposed. The truth was closer than ever, and Charles Woodford would stop at nothing to keep it buried. Chapter 8. The web tightens. The days following David Bennett's confession had been a whirlwind. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, had kept a sharp eye on both him and Charles Woodford. With the mayor's true nature now laid bare, and David's reluctant role in the unfolding drama, Miss Marple was closer than ever to unmasking the full extent of the tangled web that had ensnared Sarah Drummond. Yet, there was one thing that still eluded her: the missing evidence, the copy of whatever Sarah had found, the key to unlocking Woodford's darkest secrets. David had hinted at its existence, but he hadn't been able to tell her where it was. Miss Marple suspected that David was terrified. He knew something dangerous about the mayor, but he was too afraid to reveal everything. It was time to apply the pressure. That morning, Miss Marple made her way to Sarah's house once more. She needed to be thorough. Perhaps something had been missed in the initial investigation. Sarah's home was untouched, save for the small changes time had made since her disappearance. But now, Miss Marple knew exactly what she was looking for. As she stepped inside, she immediately noticed the unsettling silence that lingered in the air. She moved through the rooms with quiet precision, her keen eyes scanning every corner. It was the study that caught her attention this time. Sarah had kept meticulous records, and Miss Marple was certain the postmistress had left something behind. Something small, perhaps innocuous to the untrained eye, but essential to unraveling the mystery. Miss Marple approached the study desk, which still had the same collection of papers scattered across it. She sifted through the pile, letters, receipts, and various official documents, but nothing stood out. Yet, something nagged at her. The papers in the drawer seemed too neat, too carefully arranged. She opened it slowly, her fingers brushing over the edges of each document. It was then she noticed something, a small compartment at the bottom of the drawer. It wasn't obvious, but Miss Marple's practiced hand found the latch hidden beneath the papers. The drawer creaked as it opened further, revealing a hidden envelope. It was unmarked, but the quality of the paper was distinct. Miss Marple held her breath as she carefully pulled it out, recognizing it as something Sarah would keep secret. The letter inside was a copy of what appeared to be a bank transfer, a significant sum of money, signed by someone Miss Marple had not yet heard of, R. Taylor. The name struck a chord. The only mention of this person had been in a previous letter Sarah had hidden. Miss Marple had dismissed it at the time, but now it seemed the connection was crucial. She read the letter carefully. Sarah, as per our agreement, the money has been transferred. This will be the last payment. You are to destroy all documents related to the matter and keep quiet. If anyone finds out, the consequences will be dire. Remember, I'm doing this for you. For both of us. R. Taylor. A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. The letter was a final settlement, a deal that Sarah had been involved in, something far beyond the mayor's manipulation. The transaction was linked to someone named R. Taylor, a figure Miss Marple had yet to encounter in the village. It was clear that Sarah had been involved in a much larger, far-reaching network than anyone could have imagined. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her thoughts spinning. She knew she had to get to the bottom of this, and fast. The truth was almost within her grasp, but there was still one last part of the puzzle missing. Who was R. Taylor, and what role had they played in Sarah's disappearance? As she left Sarah's house clutching the envelope, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to David Bennett. He was the key to unlocking this final piece. The web had been cast wide, but David seemed to be at the center of it all. He had known enough to be involved, but Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that he was still holding back. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple arrived at David's shop. He was behind the counter, nervously arranging some jars, but he looked up when she entered, his face pale and drawn. The tension between them was palpable. "Miss Marple," he said softly, almost hesitantly, "what brings you back today?" "I believe we need to talk again, David," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "There's something I've uncovered that I think you'll want to see." She reached into her bag and pulled out the letter from Sarah's study. David's eyes widened as he saw it, and his hands shook slightly as he took it from her. "You know about R. Taylor, don't you?" Miss Marple asked, watching his every reaction. David's face went ashen. He swallowed hard before speaking. Yes, I know the name. But I didn't think Sarah didn't want me involved. I didn't know how deep it went. I swear I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "David," Miss Marple said gently, her tone softening, "I know you're afraid. But this is bigger than either of us. And it's too late to pretend you don't know anything. I need you to tell me everything. Who is R. Taylor?" David's hands trembled as he set the letter down on the counter. He took a deep breath, as though preparing for something he had been dreading. R. Taylor is someone from the mayor's past, a former associate. They've been involved in things, business deals, shady transactions. But Sarah didn't know how bad it was. She found out, and that's when everything started falling apart. She tried to distance herself, but someone didn't want her to walk away. Miss Marple finished for him, her voice steady. "And now you're here, caught in the middle of it all." David nodded slowly, his face contorted with guilt and fear. "I never wanted to be part of any of this. But now that I'm in, I can't get out." Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her mind racing as the last pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. R. Taylor was someone powerful, someone connected to the mayor, and someone who had played a key role in Sarah's disappearance. And now, Sarah had paid the price for uncovering their secrets. It was clear now. Sarah had not just been an innocent victim. She had been a whistleblower, someone who had stumbled upon something dark and dangerous. She had tried to confront the powers behind it, and in doing so, had sealed her fate. "David," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but resolute, "I need you to help me find R. Taylor. We can't let this go on any longer. We're so close to uncovering the truth." David nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I'll help you, Miss Marple. I'll do whatever it takes." As Miss Marple left the shop, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. The threads were finally coming together. But the most dangerous part of the web was yet to be exposed. R. Taylor was still out there, and Charles Woodford would stop at nothing to protect the secrets they shared. But Miss Marple was ready. The truth was within her reach, and she would stop at nothing to bring it to light, no matter the cost. The web was tightening, and soon the people of Brimley would learn just how deep the lies ran. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. The quiet village of Brimley had always been a place where secrets could remain buried for years. But now, the weight of those secrets had become impossible to ignore. With each new revelation, the mystery of Sarah Drummond's disappearance had grown darker, more complex. Miss Marple had uncovered enough to understand that the mayor, Charles Woodford, had been at the center of it all. His greed, his power, and his manipulation had caused irreparable harm. But there was still one thing left to do. Expose the final piece of the puzzle. The last piece was R. Taylor. Whoever they were, they had been lurking in the shadows, pulling strings and making sure that Sarah's disappearance remained just that, a disappearance. Miss Marple had spent days trying to track down the elusive figure, but the answers remained just out of reach. It was time for one final confrontation. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple made her way back to the mayor's office. The village was quieter than usual, the setting sun casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. She had a plan now, and everything she needed was in place. David Bennett had agreed to help her find R. Taylor, but Miss Marple knew that the confrontation would be dangerous. The mayor was already on edge, and if they were to get to the truth, they had to act quickly. As she entered the mayor's office, Woodford was seated behind his desk, his eyes narrowing when he saw her. He knew what was coming, and he knew that there was nothing he could do to stop it. The game was over. "Miss Marple," Woodford said, his voice tight with frustration. "What is it this time?" "I'm not here for pleasantries, Woodford," Miss Marple replied coolly, her gaze unwavering. "I have one final question for you. Where is R. Taylor?" Woodford's face turned pale, but he tried to hide it behind a veneer of calm. "R. Taylor is no concern of yours. You've already meddled too much." "Is that so?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but filled with an edge of authority. "Because, you see, I have enough evidence to bring you down." "But I don't want to just bring you down, Mr. Woodford. I want to know the whole story. I want to know what Sarah found and why you couldn't let her walk away." Woodford's hand twitched, the familiar mask of control slipping for a moment. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, his eyes darting toward the door as if searching for an escape. "There is no escape, Charles," Miss Marple said, her tone soft but insistent. "Sarah Drummond was a good woman. She uncovered something about you and R. Taylor that was bigger than your petty affairs and blackmail. You thought you could silence her, but now the truth is coming out." Woodford stood up, his posture rigid with defiance. "You think you can solve this, Miss Marple? You think you can tear down everything I've built? I've been playing the game for too long, and you're nothing but an old woman playing at detective work. Do you really think anyone will believe you?" Miss Marple stood her ground. "It's not about what I think, Charles. It's about what's been done. And you can't hide behind your power anymore." There was a long silence as the weight of Miss Marple's words settled between them. Finally, Woodford's shoulders slumped, the last of his bravado crumbling. He exhaled a long breath as if releasing the tension that had been building for years. "You think you know everything, don't you?" Woodford said, his voice barely a whisper. "R. Taylor, it's a name from my past. A partner in crime, someone who helped me cover up the messes I couldn't clean up myself. But you're right, I couldn't let Sarah expose it. She knew too much. And when she started digging into things she shouldn't have, I had no choice but to silence her. You're saying you had her killed? Miss Marple asked, her voice low, her eyes cold. Woodford looked away, his eyes dark with guilt and fear. I didn't kill her, no. But I knew what would happen. I sent her a message. I made sure she understood the consequences. But she wouldn't stop. She went to meet R. Taylor, and after that, I lost control. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. R. Taylor had been the one to deal with Sarah, the one who had followed through with the mayor's threats. It wasn't just Woodford's power that had caused Sarah's disappearance. It was the people who had worked with him, people who were just as dangerous. Where is R. Taylor now? Miss Marple asked, her voice growing firmer. Woodford's eyes met hers, and for the first time, he didn't look away. R. Taylor is dead, he said simply. I made sure of it. Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed the revelation. R. Taylor was dead? But that couldn't be the end of the story. There was more to uncover. What had R. Taylor known? And why had they been so pivotal to the mayor's operation? Suddenly, the door to the mayor's office opened, and David Bennett stepped in, his face pale and anxious. Miss Marple, he said, his voice shaky. I found something. It's about R. Taylor. Woodford's eyes flicked toward the door, and for a moment he seemed ready to spring into action, but he didn't. Instead, he simply looked defeated. David walked over to Miss Marple, handing her a small, old-fashioned ledger. I found this hidden in my shop. I didn't know what it was at first, but when I opened it, I saw R. Taylor's name in every other entry. They were the one laundering money for the mayor, covering up the real business. R. Taylor had connections that went far beyond Brimley. Miss Marple flipped through the pages quickly, her eyes scanning the records. The name R. Taylor appeared frequently, linked to large sums of money and numerous transactions. Miss Marple felt the pieces finally clicked together. R. Taylor had been the go-between, the one who had handled the mayor's most illicit activities, and now they were dead, their role in the operation erased. As Miss Marple set the ledger down in the desk, she turned to Woodford. You're finished, Charles. Your empire is crumbling. R. Taylor is dead, but everything they did is right here in this ledger, and soon everyone will know the truth. Woodford's face twisted with fury, but it was clear that the fight had left him. He had been cornered, and there was no escape. You think you've won, Miss Marple? He spat. You've exposed my secrets, but you can't undo the damage. I don't need to undo anything, Charles, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but final. The truth is all that matters now. Miss Marple left the mayor's office, feeling the weight of the victory settle over her. The mystery had been solved. Sarah Drummond had been silenced by the very man she had tried to expose, but Miss Marple had made sure the truth would come out. Charles Woodford's grip on Brimley was finally over, and the people of the village would know the full extent of his corruption. As Miss Marple walked through the village square, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The web of lies had been unraveled, and justice had been done, though it had come at a great cost. But in the end, the truth had won. And that, she knew, was all that truly mattered. Chapter 10. The Final Revelation. The days following the confrontation at the mayor's office were a blur of activity. Ms. Marple had seen many secrets unravel in her lifetime, but the sheer scale of the web that had ensnared Brimley had left even her shaken. Charles Woodford, the respected mayor, was arrested, and the full extent of his corrupt dealings was exposed to the village. Yet, even as the village's social fabric began to repair itself, there was still the lingering question. What had truly happened to Sarah Drummond? Miss Marple knew that while Woodford's arrest had been a necessary step, it was only part of the puzzle. The final piece was still elusive. Sarah had disappeared without a trace, and while her name had been cleared, Miss Marple couldn't rest until she knew the full story. The morning was quiet in Brimley, the sun casting a gentle light over the cobblestone streets. Miss Marple sat at her window, watching the village slowly wake up. The air was calm, almost serene. But the calmness felt like a prelude to something. Perhaps closure, or perhaps just another unanswered question. The mystery of Sarah Drummond's disappearance had been solved, yet Sarah herself was still missing. It wasn't until she received a letter that afternoon that Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued again. The letter was from Margaret Wood, Sarah's longtime friend, and it was brief but to the point. Miss Marple, I need to speak with you. It's about Sarah. I know where she is. Please, meet me at Sarah's house tonight. Margaret. As the sun began to set, Miss Marple made her way to Sarah's cottage. She had a sense of foreboding, a feeling that something important was about to be revealed. Margaret was waiting by the door, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red, as if she had been crying for days. Miss Marple, Margaret said softly, opening the door. I'm so glad you could come. Please come inside. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the familiar surroundings of Sarah's home. It hadn't changed much since her last visit. The same knickknacks on the shelves, the same small vase of fresh flowers on the table. But there was an undeniable air of sadness, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Margaret led Miss Marple to the sitting room, where a single envelope lay on the table. It was simple, unmarked, and the paper was worn, as though it had been handled countless times. Margaret hesitated before speaking. I found this in Sarah's things, Margaret said, her voice trembling. She must have hidden it. I didn't know what to do with it, but I think you should see it. Miss Marple took the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside there was a single letter, the handwriting unmistakable. It was Sarah's handwriting. To my dearest friend, I've made the hardest decision of my life. What I've uncovered is not something that can be ignored, and I can't stand to live with the burden of it anymore. Charles Woodford has done terrible things, things that go beyond anything anyone can imagine. But there is someone else, someone who's been behind it all. Someone even more dangerous than he is. I've tried to confront them, but I fear I'm too late. If you find this, please go to the authorities. Tell them everything. I've left Brimley for good, and I don't know if I'll ever come back. But know that I did this to protect everyone. Sarah. Miss Marple slowly placed the letter back in the envelope. Her hands were steady, but inside, her heart was racing. Sarah had known about R. Taylor, and she had known the danger they posed. Sarah had been planning to leave Brimley, to escape the clutches of Woodford and his mysterious associate. But in the end, she had disappeared. Had she left on her own terms? Or had something happened to her before she could execute her plan? Do you think she's still alive? Margaret asked, her voice breaking the silence. Miss Marple looked at Margaret, her expression somber. I believe Sarah is alive, yes. She was too strong, too determined to be silenced completely. I think she left Brimley on her own, and she's been hiding in plain sight. Margaret's eyes filled with hope. You really think she's alive? I do, Miss Marple said, her voice firm, and I think she's waiting for the right moment to return. But for now, it's enough that we know the truth. Charles Woodford is finished. Our tailor is gone. Sarah can come back when she's ready and when it's safe. As Miss Marple left Sarah's cottage, the sky above Brimley was painted with the deep purples and oranges of the setting sun. There was something almost symbolic about the colors, like the end of a long, painful chapter. The village, though scarred, was healing. The lies had been exposed and justice had been served. But the story wasn't over. Sarah had left, but her journey wasn't done yet. And Miss Marple knew that someday, when the time was right, Sarah would return. For now, the village would carry on. The truth was known, and the people who had been complicit in the darkness that had overshadowed Brimley were held accountable. Charles Woodford's empire had crumbled, and with it, the hold of fear and manipulation that had gripped the village for so long. But as Miss Marple walked down the familiar streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah Drummond's story was far from finished. It was just the beginning of something new. The mystery had been solved, but the real revelation had only just begun. And for Miss Marple, that was enough. For now.